This is a story from my life, something that happened to me, and it's a difficult thing to talk about, but I need to. The cold dread began the moment my mother's perfectly manicured hand rested on my shoulder, her voice a silken lie as she said, "Darling, it's just a thing. We'll find it." We were standing in the middle of my childhood bedroom in her Beacon Hill townhouse, the late afternoon sun slanting through the bay windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The only chaotic things in a room, in a house that was otherwise curated to perfection. But my world was chaos. My engagement ring, the one Ben had slipped on my finger just 48 hours before, was gone. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the Boston winter outside, that the woman feigning concern beside me was the one who had taken it. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My mother, Eleanor Vance, did not operate with blunt instruments. Her weapons were suggestion, disappointment, and a brand of passive aggression, so refined it could be displayed at the Museum of Fine Arts. She had hated Ben from the moment I brought him home. Ben was real. He was a software developer from a working-class family in Somerville who had built his own company from nothing. He was kind, he was brilliant, and he saw me, Clara, not the Vance family name and the trust fund attached to it. To my mother, his lack of pedigree was a stain he could never wash away. "He's a nice boy, I suppose," she'd said after their first meeting, the same tone she used when describing a reasonably clean subway car. "A bit unpolished. But I'm sure he has ambitions." Her smile was a tight, bloodless thing. It never reached her eyes, which were constantly assessing, calculating, and judging. For 6 months, she'd waged a quiet war. She'd forget to include him in invitations to family events. She'd introduce me to the sons of her friends. "Just for a chat, darling, Carter just got back from his residency at Mass General. You'd find him fascinating." As if Ben didn't exist. She'd critique his choice of clothes, his taste in wine, the way he held his fork. Each comment was a tiny, poison dart aimed at the heart of our relationship. I had foolishly thought the engagement would change things. When Ben proposed at the top of the Prudential Tower, with the entire city glittering below us, I had cried with a joy so pure it felt like it could erase all my mother's bitterness. The ring wasn't some ostentatious rock she would have chosen. It was a vintage piece from the 1920s, an heirloom from Ben's great-grandmother. A delicate platinum band with a small, perfect sapphire flanked by 2 tiny diamonds. It was modest, elegant, and filled with a history of love that my own family, for all its wealth, sorely lacked. My mistake, my catastrophic, life-altering mistake, was bringing it to her house. We were supposed to announce the engagement that night at a family dinner she was hosting. A dinner she had insisted upon. When I arrived that afternoon, giddy and nervous, I'd taken the ring off to help her with the flower arrangements, worried the delicate prongs might snag on something. "Let me put that somewhere safe for you, dear," she'd said, her voice like honey. "You know how you can be. A little forgetful." She'd taken it from my palm, her cool fingers brushing against mine, and for a split second, a warning bell chimed in the back of my mind. But I ignored it. I wanted her approval so desperately. I was willing to believe in a truce that had never been offered. An hour later, when I went to put it back on before the guests arrived, it was gone. And my mother, the picture of maternal concern, was helping me tear my room apart, her face a mask of sympathy that I could suddenly see right through. The search was a farce, a piece of theater she was directing. She suggested I check my purse for the 10th time. She wondered aloud if it had fallen down the sink drain, a place it had never been near. With every dead end, her performance of worry grew, and the cold knot in my stomach tightened. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the faint, triumphant gleam in her eyes. The tiny, almost imperceptible upturn of her lips. She was enjoying this. She was savoring my panic. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't about a lost ring. This was a declaration of war. My mother had just made her opening move, and she believed she had already won. She had underestimated me. She had no idea how much I was like her. The first guests were due to arrive in less than an hour. The doorbell would soon chime, signaling the start of an evening designed not for celebration, but for my public humiliation. I could already picture the scene, me ringless and distraught, my mother, the comforting matriarch, explaining to our relatives that there had been a slight mishap, but that we were all hoping for the best. She would spin it as a bad omen, a sign from the universe. Her friends, women cut from the same icy cloth, would offer their plastic sympathies while exchanging knowing glances. See, not meant to be. The boy was beneath her. The thought sent a jolt of rage through me, so hot and sharp it momentarily eclipsed the panic. I stopped searching. I stood up from the floor, where I'd been padding under my antique vanity, and smoothed down my dress. My hands were shaking. I clenched them into fists at my sides. "It's not here," I said, my voice quiet but steady. Eleanor stopped her own performative rustling through my bookshelf. "Don't give up, darling. It must be here somewhere. A thing like that doesn't just walk away." The condescension in her voice was a physical slap. A thing like that. To her, it was an object, an insufficient one at that. She couldn't comprehend that its value to me was measured in love, not carrots. "No," I said, meeting her cool gray eyes. "It doesn't." I walked out of the bedroom and down the grand, curving staircase of the house I grew up in. Every object was a memory, every portrait on the wall a silent witness to a childhood spent striving for an affection that was always conditional. The house itself felt like a cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. I needed to think, not as the panicked, heartbroken girl my mother saw, but as a strategist. What did I know about my mother? I knew she was a creature of habit and sentiment, but only for things she valued. She was meticulously organized. If she had taken the ring, it wouldn't be carelessly tossed in a drawer. It would be placed somewhere deliberate, somewhere meaningful to her, a place that would serve as a private monument to her victory. My father's study. It had been left almost exactly as it was the day he died 10 years ago. It was my mother's shrine to the man whose name and fortune she had so expertly managed. She was the grieving widow to the world, but I knew the truth. Theirs had been a marriage of convenience, a merger of two prominent Boston families. He had been a kind but distant man, more interested in his collection of maritime maps than in his own family. But my mother had curated their history into a grand love story. She was the keeper of his legacy, and, I suspected, the keeper of my ring. The study was at the back of the house, paneled in dark mahogany and smelling faintly of old paper and leather. I pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. Nothing seemed out of place. The massive desk was clear, the leather-bound books stood in perfect rows. But I wasn't looking for something out of place. I was looking for the one place my mother felt truly secure. Her sanctuary within a sanctuary. On the mantelpiece, above the unlit fireplace, was a collection of silver-framed photographs. My mother and father on their wedding day. My brother and me as children. And in the center, a large photo of my father alone, smiling faintly at his desk. Beside it was his antique rosewood humidor. He'd quit smoking cigars years before he passed, but he'd always kept the box on his desk, filled with old letters and keepsakes. My mother never touched it. It was his. My heart started to beat faster. It was too perfect. A place of sentiment, a place of security, a place I would never think to look. It was a symbol of the man whose approval she craved even in death, a man she was likely telling herself would have approved of her actions today. My hands trembled as I reached for the humidor. It was heavier than I remembered. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed letters, lay my engagement ring. The sapphire glittered up at me from the dark wood, a tiny captured star. It was a jewel, but in that moment it felt like a prisoner, and I was its liberator. A wave of nausea and fury washed over me. Seeing it there, in his box, felt like a desecration of both his memory and my future. She hadn't just hidden it, she had entombed it. She had symbolically replaced my future with her version of the past. I picked up the ring, its cool metal a familiar comfort against my skin, and slipped it back on my finger. It felt like a piece of my soul clicking back into place. I closed the humidor and turned, my breath catching in my throat. My mother was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed. Her mask of concern had vanished. In its place was a look of cold, unyielding disapproval. "I knew you'd find it if you just calmed down," she said, her voice utterly devoid of warmth. "You've always been so dramatic, Clara." The gaslighting was so audacious, so complete, that I could only stare at her. There was no apology, no explanation, just a dismissal of my feelings and an assertion of her control. She had been caught, but she was acting as if she had been the one to solve the problem. "Why, Mother?" I whispered, the words barely audible. "Why would you do this?" She sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of parental burden. "Because I love you," she said, as if that explained everything. "I cannot stand by and watch you throw your life away on that boy. He is not our kind. He will drag you down, and you are too brilliant, too special to be dragged down. This engagement is a mistake, and it is my duty as your mother to protect you from your own worst impulses." She took a step into the room. "Now, put the ring back in the box. We'll tell everyone you've come to your senses. We can say it was a mutual decision. No embarrassment. It will be for the best." That was the moment something inside me broke. The part of me that had spent 26 years craving her approval, the part that had twisted myself into pretzels trying to be the daughter she wanted, it just snapped. I looked from the ring on my finger to the cold, arrogant woman standing before me, and I saw my future laid out in two distinct paths. One was here, in this house, under her thumb, a life of quiet desperation and performative happiness. The other was unknown, terrifying, but it was mine. It was with Ben. "No," I said. The word was small, but it felt like a cannon blast in the quiet study. Her eyes narrowed. "What did you say to me?" I said no. I took a step back toward the window. "This dinner is off. My engagement is not. And you and I think we're done." I didn't wait for her reply. I turned and walked out of the study, past the portraits of my ancestors, down the grand staircase, and out the heavy front door, into the cold Boston air. I didn't have my coat. I didn't have my purse. But I had my ring, and for the first time in my life, I was truly free. My phone was in my pocket. My fingers were numb as I pulled it out and dialed Ben's number. He answered on the first ring. "Clara? Is everything okay?" I was about to head over. "Don't," I said, my voice shaking but clear. "Change of plans. Pack a bag. A small one. Meet me at South Station in an hour. And Ben? Yeah. Bring your passport." The train ride from Boston's South Station to New York's Penn Station was a blur. I sat huddled against the window, the city lights smearing into ribbons of neon and gold as we raced south through the darkness. Ben sat beside me, his hand holding mine, his warmth a steady anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. He hadn't asked many questions. When I'd arrived at the station, shivering in my cocktail dress, my face pale and tear-streaked, he had simply wrapped his coat around my shoulders, picked up my single, hastily packed bag, and said, "Okay, let's go." Now, in the relative quiet of the Acela Express, the story came tumbling out of me. The missing ring, the fake search, the humidor, the cold, calculating cruelty of my mother's confession. Ben listened without interrupting, his expression hardening with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. "I knew she didn't like me," he said finally, his voice low and tight. "I didn't realize she was a monster." "She's not a monster," I said, the words tasting like a lie even as I said them. "Years of conditioning died hard. She's controlling. She thinks she's doing the right thing. By stealing from you? By emotionally manipulating you an hour before you're supposed to announce the happiest news of your life? Clara, that's not protection. It's possession." He was right. He was so completely right. My mother didn't see me as a person. She saw me as an extension of herself, a living asset to be managed and curated like her stock portfolio or her art collection. My choice of husband was a bad investment, and she was simply cutting her losses. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since we'd left. A string of texts and missed calls from my mother, my brother, my aunt. The family's flying monkeys had been dispatched. I powered it off and dropped it into my bag. It felt like severing a final cord. We spent the night at the TWA Hotel at JFK Airport, a strange, beautiful time capsule of a place. It felt appropriate, like we had stepped out of our own timeline and into a new one. The next morning, we were on the first flight to Las Vegas. The decision had been impulsive, made over overpriced cocktails in the hotel's sunken lounge. If my mother wanted a traditional, pedigreed wedding, I would give her the exact opposite. We were married by a man dressed as Elvis in a small, slightly dusty chapel just off the Strip. Our witnesses were a retired couple from Ohio who were renewing their own vows. I wore a simple white sundress I'd bought at a tourist shop. Ben was in jeans and a new button-down shirt. I held a bouquet of fake silk roses. And it was the most perfect, most romantic moment of my life. As Elvis serenaded us with a surprisingly heartfelt rendition of Can't Help Falling in Love, I looked at Ben, at his kind face and loving eyes, and I knew I had made the right choice. This was real. Our love wasn't contingent on family approval or financial statements. It was just ours. We sent one picture to my family. A selfie of us, grinning like idiots, my hand held up to the camera to flash the sapphire ring, the gaudy chapel sign glowing behind us. The text I sent with it was simple. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. Then I blocked my mother's number. And my brother's. And my aunt's. The ensuing explosion was nuclear. My mother, I later learned from a sympathetic cousin, had a full-blown meltdown. She told the family that I had been brainwashed, that Ben had kidnapped me and forced me to marry him to get at the family money. She hired a private investigator to find us. She called the police in Las Vegas and tried to file a missing persons report. She was a woman unhinged, her carefully constructed world shattered by a single act of defiance. And that was when she made her next move. She went for the money. I had a trust fund, set up by my grandfather, that I was due to receive a significant portion of on my 30th birthday. But my mother was the trustee. And with the stroke of a pen, she froze everything. I received a letter from her lawyer at our new, tiny apartment in Portland, Oregon, a city we'd chosen for its distance and its difference from Boston. The letter was cold and clinical. It stated that due to my reckless and unstable behavior, my mother, in her capacity as trustee, was exercising her right to withhold all funds indefinitely, pending a thorough psychological evaluation to determine my fitness to manage my own affairs. It was blackmail, pure and simple. She thought she could starve us out. She thought that without the safety net of my inheritance, I would come crawling back, begging for forgiveness. She still had no idea who I was. The day that letter arrived, I didn't cry. I got angry. A cold, clear, clarifying anger. This wasn't just about my elopement anymore. This was about my entire life. She wanted a war? She would get one. But I wasn't going to fight her on her terms. I wasn't going to get into a messy legal battle over the trust that could drag on for years. I was going to hit her where she lived. Not in her bank account, but in her reputation. My mother's entire identity was built on her public image as a philanthropist, a patron of the arts, the benevolent chairwoman of the Vance Family Foundation. It was my father's legacy, a charitable organization dedicated to funding arts education in underprivileged Boston schools. To the world, she was Saint Eleanor of Beacon Hill. But I knew better. I'd spent one miserable summer working as her assistant at the foundation. I'd seen things. Discrepancies. Vague invoices for consulting fees paid to her interior designer. Foundation funds used to purchase art that ended up in her own living room. At the time, I was too young and too intimidated to understand what I was seeing. But now I understood perfectly. My mother was using my father's legacy as her personal slush fund. And I suddenly knew exactly how I was going to get my life back. I turned to Ben, the lawyer's letter trembling in my hand. "I think I know how to end this," I said, a plan beginning to form in my mind, a plan as cold and intricate as my mother's own heart. And she'll never see it coming. The key to dismantling my mother's empire was a man named Arthur Abernathy. He had been my father's closest friend and the Vance Family Foundation's accountant for over 30 years. He was a quiet, meticulous man with an unshakable sense of integrity, a quality that had put him on a collision course with my mother after my father's death. 2 years after my dad passed, my mother had forced Mr. Abernathy into early retirement. The official story was that he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren in Vermont. The truth was that he had started asking too many questions about her expense reports. I remembered a tense conversation I'd overheard, my mother's voice sharp and cutting, Mr. Abernathy's calm but firm. A week later, he was gone. Finding him was the first step. Ben, with his digital wizardry, tracked him down in less than a day to a small, picturesque town near Stowe. I wrote him a letter. I didn't mention my mother or the foundation directly. I simply said that I was married, living in Portland, and that I desperately needed to speak with him about my father. I included my phone number. He called 2 days later. His voice was older, thinner than I remembered, but still kind. He was hesitant at first, wary of dredging up the past. But when I told him what my mother had done, hiding the ring, freezing my trust, accusing Ben of brainwashing me, the caution in his voice was replaced by a familiar weariness. "That sounds like Eleanor," he said with a sigh. "She always believed the world should bend to her will. Your father, he was a good man, Clara. He would be heartbroken to see this." That was the opening I needed. I explained my suspicions about the foundation, the vague memories I had of questionable invoices and misallocated funds. I asked him if my suspicions were just the imaginings of a bitter daughter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the gentle ticking of a clock in the background. "Your father was a very careful man," Mr. Abernathy said finally, his voice low and conspiratorial. "He loved your mother in his own way, but he wasn't blind to her appetites. He worried about what would happen to his work, to the foundation, after he was gone. He put safeguards in place." My heart leaped. "What safeguards?" "He kept a second set of books," Arthur explained. "A complete digital copy of every transaction, every invoice, every donation, stored on an independent, off-site server. A just-in-case ledger. He gave me the access credentials just before his last surgery. He made me promise that if I ever suspected Eleanor was not honoring the Foundation's mission, I would use them to protect his legacy." "And do you still have them?" I asked, my voice trembling with anticipation. "I do," he said. "I never destroyed them. I suppose I always felt that one day, your father's daughter might come looking for the truth." A week later, a small, encrypted USB drive arrived in a FedEx envelope. It contained everything. Years of my mother's systematic fraud, laid out in pristine spreadsheets and scanned receipts. It was worse than I had ever imagined. She had been treating the Foundation's endowment like her own personal ATM. There were payments for landscaping at the Beacon Hill house, tuition for a distant cousin's Swiss boarding school, a charitable donation that was actually the final payment on her Mercedes. The most damning discovery was a series of wire transfers to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, disguised as grants to a non-existent international arts program. She had embezzled nearly $2 million. It was a federal crime. Staring at the screen, at the irrefutable proof of her greed, I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, hollowing sadness. This woman, my own mother, was a common thief hiding behind a veil of Bostonian high society. Ben and I hired a forensic accountant and a shark of a lawyer in Portland. They spent a month verifying everything, building an airtight case. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Davis with eyes as sharp as broken glass, laid out my options. "We can take this to the district attorney in Massachusetts," she said, steepling her fingers on her polished desk. "She'll be indicted. There will be a very public trial. She will almost certainly go to prison." I imagined my mother in a courtroom, her perfect facade crumbling under the weight of her crimes. I imagined her name dragged through the mud, her face splashed across the Boston Globe. And a part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl who just wanted her mom to be proud of her, recoiled. But the other part of me, the woman she had created with her cruelty and control, knew that public humiliation was the only language she understood. Prison was an outcome, but it wasn't the goal. The goal was freedom. My freedom. "There's another way," I said, looking at Ms. Davis. "I don't want her in jail. I want her out of my life. I want what is rightfully mine. and I want her to dismantle her own power structure. A slow, predatory smile spread across the lawyer's face. I like the way you think, Mrs. Peterson. So we set a trap. The trap was the Foundation's annual fundraising gala, the crown jewel of the Boston social season. It was my mother's personal stage, the one night a year she could play the role of the city's benevolent queen. It was scheduled for a Saturday night in October at the Boston Public Library. I booked a flight. For the first time in almost a year, I was going home. I wasn't the same girl who had fled in the middle of the night. I was a woman with a purpose. I was no longer a pawn in my mother's game. I was the player who was about to checkmate the queen. The night of the gala, I stood across the street in Copley Square, watching the black cars pull up to the library's grand entrance. The city's elite, dressed in tuxedos and designer gowns, glided up the marble steps oblivious. Ben stood beside me, his hand a warm, steady presence on the small of my back. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs. I looked at the magnificent building, all lit up and glowing against the night sky. It looked like a palace. My mother's palace. She built her kingdom on my father's name, I said, my voice cold and even. Tonight, I'm taking it back. I pulled a simple, elegant black coat tighter around myself and started across the street. The battle was about to begin. I didn't use a ticket to get into the gala. I used a side entrance, the one reserved for catering staff, a route I remembered from my teenage years of being forced to volunteer at these events. My heels clicked softly on the polished stone floors of the empty hallway as I made my way toward the clamor of the party. The sounds grew louder as I approached the library's famous Bates Hall. The clinking of champagne glasses, the murmur of hundreds of conversations, the swell of a string quartet playing something by Vivaldi. I paused just outside the grand archway, my heart pounding a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs. Through the doorway I could see her. My mother was holding court in the center of the room, a vision in a sapphire blue gown that perfectly matched her cold eyes. She was laughing, her head tilted back, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She looked beautiful, powerful, and completely untouchable. A queen in her castle. I took another breath, straightened my shoulders, and stepped into the light. For a few moments, nobody noticed me. I was just another face in a sea of Boston's wealthiest. But then a few heads started to turn. A gasp here, a whispered comment there. The ripples spread through the crowd until they reached the center. One of my mother's friends touched her arm and pointed. Eleanor turned. Her smile froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks. For a single glorious second, I saw pure, unadulterated shock in her eyes. It was quickly replaced by a furious, icy glare. She excused herself from her circle and began gliding toward me, her movements stiff with rage. She looked like a predator closing in on its prey. She didn't realize that I was the one who had set the snare. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my bicep like claws. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "How dare you show your face here?" "I'm a Vance," I said calmly, pulling my arm from her grasp. "This is my father's foundation. I have every right to be here." "You have no rights," she seethed. "You threw your rights away when you ran off with that nobody." "We need to talk, Mother." "Not here. In private. We have nothing to talk about. Get out before I have security throw you out." "I don't think you want to do that," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I leaned in closer. "I know about the Cayman Islands account, Mother. I know about the invoices from the art gallery. I know everything." The blood drained completely from her face. Her perfectly applied lipstick suddenly looked garish against her pale skin. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish. For the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. Genuine, gut-wrenching fear. She grabbed my arm again, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was with desperation. "The reading room," she managed to choke out, and practically dragged me out of the hall and down a corridor to a small, private study reserved for high-level donors. She shut the heavy oak door behind us, plunging the room into a muffled silence. She turned on me, her composure shattered. "What is this? Some kind of sick joke? Are you trying to blackmail me?" I'm not trying to do anything, I said, walking calmly to the fireplace and turning to face her. I've already done it. I have copies of every fraudulent transaction you've made for the last 9 years. I have bank statements from your offshore account. I have sworn affidavits from 2 former board members and your old accountant, Arthur Abernathy. I have enough evidence to send you to prison for a very, very long time. She sank into a leather armchair, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked smaller, older. The queen had been dethroned. What do you want? She whispered. It was the question I had been waiting for. I pulled a sheaf of documents from the inside pocket of my coat and laid them on the table beside her. This is what I want, I said. First, you are going to instruct your lawyer to immediately dissolve the freeze on my trust. You are going to sign over your trusteeship to a neutral third party chosen by my lawyer. The principal and all accrued interest will be wired to my account within 48 hours. I slid the first document toward her. Second, you are going to resign as chairwoman of this foundation. Effective immediately. You will cite personal health reasons. You will never again attach your name, or my father's name, to any charitable endeavor. I slid a second document, a letter of resignation, across the table. And third, I said, my voice hardening, you are going to disappear from my life. You will not contact me, my husband, or any future children I may have. You will not speak of me to the press or to the family. To you, I no longer exist. If you violate any of these terms, this entire file, I tapped a thick manila envelope I placed on the table, goes directly to the U.S. Attorney's office. Is that clear? She stared at the papers, then up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. You would do this to your own mother? You stopped being my mother the day you stole my ring and hid it in my dead father's humidor. I said, my voice utterly flat. You are just a person who gave birth to me. And now, you are a criminal who is going to do exactly as I say. I pushed a pen across the table. Sign them. For a long moment she didn't move. I could see the war raging inside her. Her pride, her rage, her instinct for self-preservation. In the end, as I knew it would, survival won. Her hand trembled as she picked up the pen. With jerky, angry movements, she signed every single page. She signed away my trust. She signed away her foundation. She signed away her daughter. When she was done, she threw the pen on the table. It rolled and came to a stop next to the manila envelope. She looked up at me, her face a ravaged mask of pure loathing. I hope you're happy, she spat. I am, I said simply. I gathered the signed documents, leaving the resignation letter on the table. I'll have someone from the board come get this. I walked to the door and paused, my hand on the knob. I turned back to look at her one last time. She was just a woman in a fancy dress, alone in a quiet room, her entire world reduced to ash. She had built her life on a foundation of lies, and I had simply kicked out the cornerstone. Goodbye, Eleanor, I said. Then I walked out and didn't look back. I found Ben waiting for me outside, the cool night air a balm on my skin. He looked at my face, and he knew. He didn't need to ask. He just opened his arms, and I walked into them. We left Boston that night and never returned. The money was wired to my account 2 days later. My mother's resignation was announced the following week, sending a quiet shockwave through the city's philanthropic circles. We used a portion of the money to start our own life, far away from the poison of my past. We bought a house, Ben's company flourished, and we built a new family, one based on love and respect, not control and obligation. Sometimes late at night, I look at the sapphire ring on my finger. It's not just a symbol of my husband's love, but a reminder of the day I chose myself. She gave me the money, but she never gave me back the years she stole, and in the silence of our new life, I realized I had never truly had a mother at all. The end.